Is the mic on? Oh, loud. So we're going to start here. If we could get those doors closed. All right. So my name is Joe Long. I'm the product unit manager of the XML Enterprise Services team at Microsoft. That means that I have responsibility for COM and DCOM and MTS and COM Plus and MSMQ and DTC and UPnP, which is most of the existing middleware technologies. And then I'm also responsible for a big chunk of Indigo, in particular reliable messaging, transactions, pub/sub, messaging queues, tools. And what I'm here today to talk to you about is kind of confronting the realities of listening to this great message about Indigo and then wondering, what are you going to do with all the applications that you have today? All of the MSMQ applications, all of the COM Plus applications, and the enormous investment that you've made in building applications to enterprise services or .NET Remoting or ASMX, and what's going to happen to them as you move over to adopt the Indigo programming model. And what we're going to end up with is a couple of slides that talk about, if you're building applications today, what is the exact right thing for you to do to best set yourself up to have a smooth, easy migration path to Indigo. The last time I gave this talk, it took about 45 minutes, so there's going to be plenty of time at the end for questions. And I'll stick around and answer any questions that you have. I know there's been some angst around some of Don's comments about .NET Remoting, and I'll do my best to address all of those concerns. I'm not going to hop up and down with excitement like Doug Purdy. My goal here is to give it to you as straight as possible with the facts that you need to do to go back and do your jobs. So let's start. So this is our obligatory WinFX slide. I don't know if on the communications pillar I can't see what you can see, but we're talking about the right-hand side, Indigo, system.messaging, and so on. And then in the fundamental system.enterprise services and what happens there. I'm also not going to talk too much, or probably not at all, about why you should go to Indigo or why Indigo is exciting. Hopefully, over the last couple of days, you've kind of gotten a sense of what a true transformationally better system Indigo is going to be. And so I'm just going to talk to you about the migration path to move over. And here's kind of the three questions and how you break it down. The first thing to think about is I have all these binary applications. There's these apps that are built and they're deployed, and they just work. And I don't want to recompile them for whatever reasons. You might not even have the source code, but you'd like to be able to start surrounding and adding value with Indigo applications. You'd like to take those applications and somehow treat them like a web service. How do you do that? And we'll talk about that. And then you also might think, I have millions of lines of code written in VB6 or in VB.NET to System Enterprise Services or System Messaging or WYSI or .NET Remote or ASMX. How do I leverage that investment? Do I have to throw it all away and move it over and rewrite it? Quick answer to that is no, you don't. There's actually a great migration path, and I'll explain that to you guys. If you get nauseous looking at builds, I apologize, because these slides have lots and lots of builds. So hold on to your seat for that one. And finally, if I'm running a new app today using technology that's actually out there shipping, how should you build your application? What technology you should use, and what bets should you make to best set yourself up to move to Indigo? So the first thing I want to talk about is the wiring up story. This is, I don't want to recompile my apps. I don't want to redeploy my apps. I just want to take advantage of this great new technology. How do I do it? And here's the picture of that. You have a client that's talking through some existing API to existing infrastructure, whether it's COM Plus infrastructure or MSMQ infrastructure, using an existing wire protocol like DCOM, to server-side infrastructure talking to a server. And the constraint that I'm placing on this problem is you can't recompile or redeploy that client or that server. And you also want, in your system of clients and servers distributed throughout your enterprise or your business, you want to be able to pick and choose which ones you upgrade at any particular time to satisfy your own business requirements as you go through and try to make some money software. So there's basically two kind of solution spaces that we could go through and do that. One way we could do it is we can go into MSMQ and COM, and we could teach that existing infrastructure how to understand the new set of protocols, all of the web service protocols like WS Security, WS Reliable Messaging, and so on. And there's some incremental advantages to doing this. For one thing, all of the existing applications get to leverage all of the great work going on in the protocols with better support for services, and so you can build internet scale applications. As the owner of MSMQ and DCOM, I'll be one of the first to say that you really shouldn't be using these technologies if you're spanning trust boundaries across the internet. But that's one of the very key design points for web services. And so if we could allow you to upgrade that binary infrastructure to support web service protocols, you have a whole new class of applications that you can build using that infrastructure. For example, one of the scenarios that you could do with that is exposing those internal business applications built on COM+ or MSMQ to business partners in a reasonable way. And the other thing is that I truly believe there's going to be this great giant wave around service-oriented technology, around Indigo. And inside of that wave, we're going to get better routers and better firewalls and better tools. And by providing a path where the existing infrastructure gets upgraded to support these protocols, you'll be able to take advantage of those better tools and better infrastructure and so on with those existing binaries, with those existing applications. So the second real big path, big solution space that we could decide to make this work is we could go into Indigo and we could teach Indigo all the old protocols. So we could teach Indigo how to use DCOM for request response. We could teach Indigo how to use the MSMQ protocols for delivering messages. The problem with this is that it doesn't solve any of the inherent problems with those protocols. Those protocols they're not interoperable, they don't work well with the internet, and so on. The other way you can think about that is what we'd be doing is building a new programming model for the existing style applications. And so we have made a very explicit decision, and afterwards you can come talk to me about whether or not you agree with this decision, that we're going to do the first solution. We're going to teach the existing stuff, the new protocols, as opposed to teaching Indigo, DCOM, and MSMQ protocols. And so here's my little build on that. So you upgrade the client infrastructure, and you can think about this as you install Longhorn on your clients, and that COM in Longhorn will be able to speak the existing wire protocols and the new web service wire protocols. And so from an existing client, via configuration change, you'll be able to specify that you now want to communicate on the wire using web service protocols. And of course, you'll always be able to use the existing wire protocols because we're never going to change those. You can also upgrade the server, and once you do that, you now, via configuration, can make a choice. Do I want my servers and my clients to be communicating via these new wire protocols, or do I want to use the existing wire protocols? And that's just a choice that you'll make along the way. The other thing it does on the server side is it exposes your server functionality as a web service. And we'll drill down to this, what it means for COM+ and MSMQ. But in short, what it means is that every COM+ application and every MSMQ application will be able to be exposed as an Indigo web service. Let's just walk through kind of the transitive closure about all the different options that we have as we go through these upgrade paths. My color coding, blue is all of the existing, and red is all the new. So we have existing client binaries, in this case, talking via upgraded infrastructure, upgraded protocols, to existing server binaries. The other option is you could upgrade both your client and your server infrastructure and communicate via the existing protocols. There's a variety of reasons that you might decide to do that. But that'll just be your choice as you go through on how you want to do it. You can also upgrade the client and leave the server exactly the same, and of course in that configuration you talk via the existing protocols. The opposite is true. Existing protocols can talk to the upgrade infrastructure existing infrastructure can talk to the upgrade infrastructure using existing protocols. And then the last one, which is of course Microsoft's nightmare, is you don't do anything at all and you stay exactly where you are. But we won't talk about that too much. So here's some of the facts about what we're going to do. There is a set of existing infrastructure that just works. So if you have ASMX web services, when we upgrade to Indigo, Indigo will natively understand those protocols. You don't have to do anything to your ASMX servers and you'll be able to communicate. Also for WYSI, what we'll do is prior to the release of Indigo, we'll release a version of WYSI that will support the Indigo protocols. And so when you install that version of WYSI, you won't have to do anything else to interoperate with Indigo. To get COM+ and MSMQ interop, you'll have to upgrade to Longhorn, and we're doing no binary interop for .NET remoting or older versions of WYSI. And at all times, you should understand that we're not doing anything to the existing protocols. DCOM and MSMQ will be fully supported in Longhorn and subsequent versions of the operating system. So let's drill down into COM+ binary interop. So here's the goals. Here's what we're going to do. Existing binaries just work. You don't have to recompile anything. One way to think about it, in Server 2003, we exposed a configuration setting where you could check a checkbox and say expose as a web service, and then give a URL for what the web service was. And you could communicate that with with RPC encoded SOAP. And it's going to be similar to that kind of thing where you would by configuration, say you want to expose it as a web service, and from then it just works, and on the wire you get all the WS protocols. This bridging service environments, the scenario you should think about is if you have a classic ASP page that has some VB script that creates and calls into a COM+ application, if that page is marking as requiring a transaction, then that uses a COM+ DTC transaction. And when you create and call your COM+ application, that transaction needs to flow so that they can list in the same transaction. Other things need to flow too, like the identity so that you can have the correct security and so on. And if you take that COM+ application and you configure it to be exposed as a web service, we need to flow, is the word we use, the service domain of what transactions running, what security is running, and some other pieces of information across the wire using web service protocols so that the web service, which is what this COM+ application has been turned into, continues to work in exactly the right way. So COM+ applications will also be able to be accessed by Indigo clients. So an Indigo client application will have no idea that the implementation you happen to do on the server was with the COM+ style that's just used by configuration exposed. All of that will be seamless. And also, Indigo Web Service can be accessed from COM clients. This is actually a really, really big deal. And the way you should think about this is that there's two ways that you'll do it. One way is that you'll export from the COM+ administrative tool a client proxy that you'll install, and from the client proxy, your existing rich clients will be able to create and call your COM+ servers as web services. But the other thing that we're going to do is build a moniker that allows you to call into a web service. And so what this will allow you to do is from inside of any like VB scriptable application like say Excel, you'll be able to call getObject, pass in a string that specifies what your web service is, and it will give you a proxy to that web service. And then you can just make method calls, normal COM method calls on it that do the web service calls, and you get back the data, and then you can populate your spreadsheet with it inside of Excel. So it provides a very strong integration for all of the existing COM clients with all of the Indigo web services that are coming out. Just here's a picture about what this would look like. This is the typical 3-tier COM+ application that runs with a browser, where you have a browser coming through HTTP to a firewall, goes through some load balancing. You end up on a middle tier server that's running both IIS and COM+, and then you do some database access with the TDS protocol to SQL Server running on a Windows cluster. And when you would upgrade the middle tier to Longhorn, that COM+ application be exposed as a web service. And so new applications can talk to those existing middle tier servers using new protocols, and all the existing applications can just work unmodified using the existing protocols. In the rich client scenario, this is just similar to what I showed the picture before. You upgrade the client and you upgrade the server, and once you do these can communicate via the web service protocols, and the server is also exposed via a web service. Here's some details. We're all developers here. So some of the requirements. First of all, you need to use a type library. The way you should think about this is that we need a lot of metadata in order to generate the WSDLs for you and generate the contract for you. And that metadata is substantially inside a type library. So we're going to require you to have a type library. That shouldn't be too onerous because if you're using COM+, 99% of the time you're using type libraries anyway. The second is you need to be installed in COM+. So COM+ provides a lot of metadata to us that we need in order to support this. So we're not going to go through and make it so an arbitrary EXE, a DCOM server, like say Excel or Word, is exposed as a web service. In order for this to work, you have to be installed in COM+. You need to declare your metadata that you're being used. So make sure that when you write your type libraries, or if you're using C++, if you're using VB, all this will happen automatically for you. But declare all your code classes and all the interfaces on each code class in the type library so that we know what interfaces you're using to communicate to that component. And this last point, I'm still going through the technical due diligence to try to get out of this requirement. But it says if you're going to be passing interface pointers around, don't pass them as IUnknown, or don't pass them as object inside of Visual Basic. Pass them as the type that you're actually going to use. So instead of passing an IUnknown and then query interface for IFOO, pass the IFOO around. And inside of Visual Basic, instead of passing object, pass foo. And that strong typing will make it easier for us to support it inside the infrastructure. These avoids are really around avoid. The explicit use of co-server info is about letting the configuration do it. Instead of doing it inside of code, do it inside of configuration. And so Host server info is a parameter that you pass into code create instance EX to specify what server you want to activate on. Instead of doing that, you should specify the server and configuration. And what that allow us to do is when you install and decide you want to expose this as a web service, we can update the configuration for you and take care of it automatically. So custom UCPs is a kind of a fringe feature inside of the latest version of COM+. It's a user context properties. Don't put interface pointers in there. Put simple types like strings and integers and so on. And for those of you who are deep into the bowels of COM and you're using security stuff, and you even know what the API co-set proxy blanket is, don't use it after you use the proxy for the first time because that'll kind of mess up the way the security works. And the will not be supported is just the corollary of the requirement that use a type library, so therefore we're not going to support proxy stub marshalling. The MSMQ drill down is actually a lot easier. The picture looks the same. You upgrade the client, you upgrade the server. MSMQ will then be able to talk via the web service protocols. Every MSMQ server application or destination will become callable as a web service. The requirements is to upgrade to Longhorn. And we've gone through all the technical due diligence on how we're going to do this, and we actually can't find anything that we think won't work. So you can just continue doing everything that you do today, and everything should just work seamlessly when you upgrade to Longhorn. So other programming models, we talked about this a little bit earlier. ASMX, Indigo V1 will support the wire protocol, which is SOAP 1.1 and SOAP 1.2 for ASMX. The latest version of WYSI, and to get to the latest version of WYSI, we'll talk about later on what you'll have to do. And .NET Remoting, there's no binary interop supported for .NET Remoting, but there's a really good story, good path for people to move the code from .NET Remoting code to Indigo code. And that is our drill down on how those things actually work. And as far as why would you even consider going through and doing this, hopefully over the last couple of days you've seen all of the great things that Don and Doug and everybody else have talked about in terms of Indigo, and you want to take advantage of Indigo. And that's, this is a path to allow you to take, kind of like nibbles on it and, build applications, deploy those applications, and use them at your own speed. And again, we talked about the wave, where there's going to be better tools, better routers, better firewalls, and this will allow you to take advantage of those things. And it's really important to me that everybody understand that we're trying to make it as easy as possible for you to move at your own speed, adopt this technology in a way that makes sense for your own business. So let's talk about migrating code. So here is our chart. I'm defining this term simple and mechanical, which is basically if you read a white paper that tells you how to do it, the white paper hopefully will be a page long, it might be longer. You read the white paper, it tells you what you have to do, and then in the best case, you just write a script which will mechanically go through and convert the code from the existing stack into the Indigo stack. So what we're going to provide is simple mechanical migration for ASMX, .NET Remoting, and enterprise services. WYSI will not be simple and mechanical to migrate, nor will system.messaging. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So let's drill into some details. First of all, the code inside the function is just CLR code, right? So that CLR code should just migrate seamlessly because the CLR is going to migrate all that code seamlessly. The parameters should work unmodified for the same reasons. The serializers will still continue to work. And this third point is really important to understand, is that you can always use the existing stack and Indigo inside the same app domain. We're not going to do anything to enterprise services, to system.messaging, to WYSI, or any of the other ones to make it so that you can't call them inside the same app domain. So it'll be a fairly common thing, I think, to use system.messaging to pull a message off of an MSMQ queue, then modify it in some way inside of user code, and then inside the same function turn around and send it down an Indigo port, and that'll work just fine. And there's existing extensibility models inside of these stacks, like .NET Remoting has channels and sinks. ASMX has these, also has their extensibility points. And Indigo is going to provide a very rich set of extensibility that's different from these existing stacks. And so when you're building applications today, you need to think about how you're using those extensibility points and build a system where you've architected it so that you can abstract away those extensibility points, so when you move to Indigo, you can write to your abstraction layer and it becomes easier for you to migrate. So here's some code. This is just a typical ASMX client code, where inside of main you're creating an accounting service. because you've gone through your WSDL and so on. And to convert this code so that this client calls into Indigo instead of ASMX, what you'll do is you'll take your system.webservices namespace and you'll rename it. This is the animation. And by the way, we're just starting. I spent countless hours on animation. But you change your namespace to the system.service model. Don talked about it in his service-oriented talk. I don't know if everybody heard his talk about this notion about location transparency and the idea that in service orientation, it's really important to understand what boundaries you're crossing, and that because of that idea, we're very intent on making it so that when you activate something remotely, it is an explicit action on your part. And because of that, we're not hooking into new. We're saying that new is used for activating local objects. And if you want to get a reference to or service reference to a remote server, you have to go through this explicit step of calling create proxy. And so we've commented out the new, and we've brought in this create proxy. But other than this code will just recompile and run on top of Indigo. On the server side, what you'll do is you'll comment out your namespace and bring in your new namespace, which is this compat namespace, and that's it. You recompile, you're done. And what we've done here, you'll notice down the bottom there's this web method with these transaction attributes. We've re-implemented the web method attribute inside of this compat namespace. And this is a way to provide it the easiest possible way for you to migrate to Indigo. And if you want to take advantage of this is really the existing ASMX program model. If you want to take advantage of the Indigo program model, you just make a few other simple changes. You drop the compat on your namespace, and you use the new service models, which is a service method on the method, and use a transaction scope attribute. And also you mark your class as being a service. All right. It only gets better. So for ASMX, like we said before, the code inside the function just works, the parameters just work, the web method attribute and the XML serialization attributes, they're fully supported. SOAP extensions will be simple mechanical to migrate. Some caveats. Indigo at its core is protocol neutral, right? So if there's this HTTP context inside of ASMX that's very tightly bound to the HTTP semantics that make absolutely no sense when you're running over TCP, or no sense when you're running over SMTP. So the information is available to the developer running over HTTP, but we're not going to support that inside of Indigo. We're also not bringing the ASP.NET state support, but of course, that you're running inside the same app domain, you have access to those classes. And we're also, in Indigo V1, not able to do any of the automatic session state support that's inside of there that survives process recycling. So that's something that you as an application developer will build into your app. Also, the WSDL model is slightly different, so we're not going to support the WSDL customization features inside of ASMX, but we will provide a full support of those scenarios. By the way, just so you know, as we go through this, I'm going to show you the code, I'm going to show you what works, I'm going to show you what doesn't work. And I don't want to make it seem that what works and what doesn't work is actually on even footing, that a vast, vast majority of everything work. I just want to be real clear and straightforward with you about what doesn't work so you have a full understanding of where you should make your investments today. So look at the .NET remoting code. Here it is. You do the same thing as before. You rename your namespace. You bring in the service model namespace, and instead of calling new, you call create proxy. Now, one of the things you should note is that this looks remarkably similar to the ASMX client. And the reason is that one of the things Indigo is a unification of ASMX, .NET remoting, and enterprise services into one stack. And what you'll see as we go through, especially the enterprise services really brings it home, is that the model of how you do that becomes one model instead of three models. So it makes it much easier for you to learn how to write all this code. The host code, which runs on the server that accepts incoming activation requests, change your namespace to service model, and the configuration changed a little bit, and so you wire up differently. But other than that, it's the same. And the object code, the code that you're activating on the server, change the namespace, and then just add a remote object tag, and everything else works exactly the same way it does today. So this is .NET remoting server code, change the namespace, add an attribute, recompile, and now you're running on top of Indigo. So with .NET remoting, and there were some angst, I've answered questions about the booth. It was kind of funny, somebody came to me and said, is .NET remoting dead? And I said, well, that's an interesting word, dead, because there's no real way that .NET remoting is dead. Most people are using .NET remoting by inside the same process, creating objects and treating them like local objects, and that model continues to work. What doesn't work is for remote objects, we're not hooking new for reasons we talked about before. The code inside your .NET remoting function just works on modified as-do parameters, and we'll fully support the transparent remoting programming model except for new, again, for exactly the same reasons that you need to make an explicit statement that you're activating something remotely as opposed to locally. And the thing that won't work inside of Indigo for .NET remoting is these extensibility points, channels, and sinks. From the customers that I've talked to, and again, you guys are more than welcome, I would really like you to come up and tell me about the reasons you're using .NET remoting channels and sinks. But what I found is that the big reason is to make up for deficiencies in the platform. You want to create a channel or sink to allow you to do security, because there's no security inside .NET remoting. And of course, when you move to Indigo, we'll have full support for security. And so you should just use the Indigo model. But if you are building these building code to these abstraction levels, with extraction layers, when you move to Indigo, you'll have to rewrite those abstractions to the Indigo model. And the one other thing is there's this, I don't know how widely used it is, this synchronization attribute inside of .NET remoting that's in support of the context-bound object. There is no context-bound object inside of Indigo, so you won't need that, and it's also not recognized by Indigo. And then here's some slides on enterprise services. You notice here that we have we derive from the service component. We're using the enterprise services namespace, and we have some class level attributes. If you want to recompile this or run on top of the Indigo infrastructure instead of the COM+ infrastructure, use a different namespace, recompile, everything just works. We've re-implemented all of these attributes inside of this namespace just like we did for ASMX. Now you might say, well, we want to take this code and we want to move it over to be more like the Indigo programming model. And what you do there is these particular class level attributes have all become method level attributes. And in this case, we've decided to use the remote object style. So we derive by Marshall by ref, and we've added this in the top. We're using the transaction attribute. We have the transaction scope per method. So this is also one of the biggest feature requests that we have for enterprise services, which is to make transactions a method level attribute instead of class level attribute. So you'll get that. You're also deriving by the Marshall by ref instead of service component. And then you also might decide that you don't want to be a remote object, you want to be a remote server. So this is exactly the same enterprise services code you saw before. And to make it a service instead of a server, you add a service attribute instead of a remote object attribute, and you add the service method indicating you want to make it public. Everything else is exactly the same. And here you'll note you don't have to derive from a base class, and so you can derive from your own object hierarchy, which I think is the second most requested feature for enterprise services. So what works? Most of the code is simple and mechanical to migrate. In the simplest case, you rename your namespace, you recompile, and your app is done. The other thing we've done is we have fully integrated the enterprise services code with the .NET configuration model and hosting model. So there's one model for HTML files, for ASPX files, for ASMX files, for .NET remoting, for enterprise services, and so on, all unified together with Indigo, ASP.NET, and IIS. And then the attributes for transaction security and lifetime management, such as JIT and object pooling and AutoDone, are all fully supported. The caveats, QC, LC, and CRM code will not be migrated. All of those scenarios will be fully supported with a new programming model. In fact, there's, like with CRM, which is near and dear to my heart since I invented that, there's actually a much better way to go about doing that using the System Transactions API. And that's the reason for trying to get people over to a new model that's actually a better model, is why we're not bringing these forward. And also the attributes that you put into the assembly in enterprise services that configure the COM+ activation model and the COM+ catalog are no longer needed or supported because that's all integrated with the way we do it with the rest of the .NET framework. So let's take a minute and talk about WYSI. So WYSI is really for early adopters who are trying to take advantage of the very leading edge of service-oriented technology, the very initial implementations of the specifications as they come out. And the reason you should be using WYSI is because it's more important to you to get the competitive advantage of being an early adopter than to be able to leverage your investment inside the WYSI code for a very long time. Because of that, we try to release it as frequently as possible. And we're not exactly 100% sure how much investment is going to be, but the promise to you is it may require a non-trivial development investment to move from one version of WYSI to another version of WYSI. And what we will do is we will provide all kinds of white paper and documentation that will tell you how to migrate that WYSI code to Indigo. And then system.messaging, we have no plans to migrate system.messaging to Indigo. You will, however, as always, be able to call the system.messaging API and the Indigo API inside of the same app domain. And you might wonder why this is a hard thing to do. I can talk about it a lot after the session. But one of the things you should realize is that with the ASMX Enterprise Services and .NET Remoting, it's all around attribute-based and bringing all those attributes forward. And system.messaging is an entirely different style of way you go through and doing that, which makes it a much bigger challenge. Okay, the last section as we fly through. The good news is you could be able to go to lunch. Prescriptive guidance. I assume most of you saw Don's talk where he did all that weird boundary violations, which I won't do. But it is important to understand the notion of boundaries when you're talking about how you should pick what application stacks you should use. And there's these two ways of building applications, an object orientation and service orientation. For me, the kind of key point comes down to, are you sharing a DLL? How are the client and the server connected? And if they're connected via sharing a binary, you end up in a situation where whenever you want to rev one, you have to rev the other. And again, I own DCOM, and so I've tried all kinds of things to make it so you can do interface-based and be able to rev the server independently of the client. And while we've been able to maintain that discipline and keep it working for a while, eventually it becomes very onerous to keep them independent. There are times when it's a very appropriate technology to use, particularly when you own both sides and you deploy them always together. That would make sense to do the object orientation style. Whereas the service orientation style exposes things via contracts, and you don't actually share a binary between the client and the server. And here's some other attributes that describe the difference between object orientation and service orientation. And then there's this notion, if you take that idea about the distinction between object orientation and service orientation, and then think about boundaries, you have platform deployment trust. One of my favorite boundaries that's not on the slide is time. And that this is the notion that over time you want to make it so that your clients and your servers can evolve independently. And that becomes a boundary, which means that the boundaries exist even on the same machine, talking cross-process. When we first initially started thinking about this and how we wanted to talk about it and how we wanted to build the software, one initial idea was that you would use services going across machine, because there you want to deploy them independently, and you would use services. You would use object technology cross-process because you always are on the same machine. You can deploy them together. But once you start getting into the notion that you want to evolve things independently over time, even on the same machine, you want to be able to use service technology. And that this is where it comes, where we say that objects should really be used when you're within a boundary. And that this is, when you not pass a boundary is actually a really kind of a hard choice when you start thinking about it deeply. And that services are appropriate both within boundaries and across boundaries. And that one of the things that we're doing with Indigo is making it so that you can take this service-oriented style of applications and in a very practical way use it across different styles of boundaries, not only cross-machine but also cross-process and so on. So here we are. Prescriptive guidance. So first of all, if you're building software today, build services. All right. If you're going to build services with ASMX. And if you are an early adopter and you have some features inside of WYSI that you think that add competitive advantage to your application, you want to take advantage of it, you can, you should. You should understand what the support policy is, and you should understand that when you move from one version of WYSI to the next version of WYSI, there may be a non-trivial investment on your part to move that code forward. But other than that, it's very appropriate to use WYSI. And then inside of your service, where you're saying, I'm not crossing a boundary, you can use object technology. And when you're using object technology, the way you should choose is you should use enterprise services if you need any of the features that are inside of enterprise services. If you need role-based security that's tightly integrated with the Windows security system. If you need transactions or object pooling. Also, if you're communicating between components on a local machine and you're running performance problems with either WYSI or ASMX, then you should use enterprise services. By the way, one of the things that we're doing Richard Turner, who's in the second row right there, is writing a white paper. It's now, I think, 46 pages long that goes through and talks about all of the issues related to moving your code to enterprise services, but also all the performance characteristics between enterprise services and remoting, cross-section with all the language selections. And we're going to publish that within the next 2 weeks on MSDN, so you can go through and read about all these things as well. For .NET remoting, there's 2 cases when you should be using .NET remoting. First of all, if you're in process going cross-app domain, .NET remoting is the best technology to use. It's very, very fast, and then Whidbey gets, I think in some cases, orders of magnitude faster. So there's investment going on there, and it's a very appropriate way to use it, and you should absolutely use it inside of the process going cross-app domain. And also, if you need to integrate with an existing proprietary protocol, you might have a host that you need to communicate to, and you want to have a way to do custom formatting and custom protocol work to communicate to the host. And the .NET remoting abstraction models for doing that channel work is very clean, very good, and you should go ahead and take advantage of that. You should just recognize that when you move to Indigo, that portion of the code will have to, the way you interface with the infrastructure will have to change. Finally, if you should use system.messaging. If there's any feature you need that happens to be inside of MSMQ, absolutely use it. But when you use it with system.messaging. So some of the caveats, if you're using ASMX, again, we talked about these extensibility points. You should avoid or abstract the low-level extensibility, like the HTTP context. For .NET remoting, you should do the same thing for syncs and channels. For enterprise services, and this is just best practice using Complus or enterprise services or using Indigo, avoid just passing object references around. I think your applications will run better anyway. Finally, don't use Complus or MSMQ native APIs. Use system.messaging or enterprise services because the .NET framework is going to make you a lot more productive. And to give you kind of a little feeler about the paper that Richard's writing, we've done some performance work where we looked at C++ calling cross-process to a Complus component implemented in C++, and enterprise in using C# calling cross-process to an enterprise service component. It turns out if you don't do anything at all, you just return from the component, that C++ is a lot faster. And the reason is that the cost is dominated by the cost of the infrastructure and doing the process switch. But if you do the very simplest database operation you can think of, which is get a connection and update one row, the performance is exactly the same between C++ and C#. It's like 169.4 on our machine and 169.3 or something like that. So if you're worried about the performance differences between the native and the managed APIs, I think you'll find that once you go through and actually start doing work and doing, solving your business problems, that performance shouldn't be a concern as you write your applications. And again, we can talk about more offline, or I can answer questions. And this white paper is coming out where you can get a lot more data. So in summary, what my goal is and what we're doing inside of Indigo is we own both the existing application technology and we're building this new technology, and we're going to build a bridge from the existing technology to the new technology that allows you to leverage all the investments that you've made using all of the existing technology that we have. All of the RPC-style programming models, .NET Remoting, Enterprise Services, ASMX, have a very easy migration path to Indigo. And you should really understand and follow the prescriptive guidance about what stacks they are today. Understand what boundaries they are. Think about boundaries as you architect your systems. And this will set you best up to use Indigo when we ship. Now we have time for some discussion or questions. Please speak into the mic because they're recording this in the back, and I'm sure people want to hear what the questions are. Thank you.
How's your, excuse me?
Okay, go ahead. I can't. Okay, right there.
So we have an ATL.com server implemented in unmanaged C++ currently.
Right.
So if we want to migrate it to the new platforms, so what should be the best approach? Like we don't want to do two migrations. First to from unmanaged code to .CLR and then to Indigo. So what should be the best strategy in the next 6 months time frame?
Okay, so the question is you have ATL Complus code and you want to migrate that code to Indigo when Indigo comes out, and you only want to migrate once. That's actually one of the big sections of Richard's white paper. And I think the easiest answer for you is going to be to migrate from C++ to managed C++, and then at the same time from Complus to Enterprise Services. And that'll have you running as Enterprise Services code with Whidbey and the .NET framework. And then when we ship, you'll be on the path of migrating from Enterprise Services to Indigo, which means you'll change your namespace from system.enterprise services to system.servicemodel.compat, recompile, and you run on top of Indigo.
So,
But you're going to be the primary customer for the white paper that's going to ship in about 2 weeks.
just another follow-up question. You're saying that the Indigo will support MSMQ. The new components, the new code that needs to be written, will that still be written in the pure C++ MSMQ? I mean, for MSMQ, or will it be like, it will be written inside the CLR?
So MSMQ, the actual infrastructure, the question is how is MSMQ going to change? So the MSMQ infrastructure will be the way it is now. And what you'll do is we will inside of MSMQ use Indigo to communicate seamlessly from your perspective on the wire using web service protocols. And that with the APIs that you should use when you're building MSMQ apps, if they're new apps, you should use system.messaging. If they're existing apps and you're using like the VB control that communicates with MSMQ, that'll work just fine, or the native APIs will work just fine. From your perspective, you won't even be able to know or tell that we've modified MSMQ to understand the web service protocols.
You said we can use system.messaging.
Yes.
But you're saying that system.messaging will not be supported in Indigo.
No, I said is that your code, the question is will system.messaging be supported in Indigo? I'm saying the code you write to system.messaging won't be migrated to Indigo code. But you'll be able to call system.messaging and Indigo code inside the same app domain. So it's fully supported, it just doesn't migrate to Indigo code.
Okay, within Indigo, what is the, let's say if you are to write a pure code targeting a message scenario, right? Like when we write code for messaging.
Okay.
Okay, so what is the code path in Indigo itself for pure messaging kind of code?
All right, so that's actually a different conversation than the migration talk, and we can talk about it offline. But basically, everything inside of Indigo is messaging code. And there's an asynchronous messaging API, and there's also a synchronous messaging API. But basically what you do is you call send message, or call send on a port.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Okay. When does Indigo provide me with all the functionality I have with system.messaging today?
So I think in Indigo V1 we'll be able to provide a superset of all of the scenarios that you would support in terms of sending and receiving messaging. I don't know if that was a funny statement or if there's an orthogonal joke going on. As far as the little details about what particular features inside of system.messaging that you want to support, I suggest you talk to Anand right here in the front, who is an expert on both system.messaging and Indigo, and he can talk to you about in infinite detail what features that you care about and how you would do that inside of Indigo. Is that right? You have another question?
No, actually the question was asked from that side.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm hopping back and forth.
Joe, when we look at COM+, we are looking at COM+ in two aspects of COM+. One is the communication aspect, which you addressed. You said you can move your enterprise services access code to Indigo. But you didn't talk about the hosting environment, all the attributes that we have had, activation semantics, just-in-time activation, object pooling.
Well, those ones I called, by the way, just to answer that, I call those the lifetime attributes. So just-in-time activation, object pooling, and auto-done will be re-implemented and fully supported inside of Indigo.
And it has no connection to the underlying COM+ then?
Yeah, these are all implementations. In Indigo won't use, the only part of COM+ that Indigo will use is the DTC, the Distributed Transaction Coordinator. The actual infrastructure itself is a new stack.
And about the manageability, about you have a way of deploying applications in COM+ and managing them and looking at in use and other statistics. How do you get that?
So the way we'll do that inside of Indigo is by leveraging all of the manageability features and functionality that is in the .NET framework. So we'll be doing end-to-end tracing with system.diagnostics and all the WMI technologies inside of Indigo. So you'll be able to get, like for example, the gentleman right here in the white shirt is John Noss, who's responsible for this for Indigo, and you can talk to him about that. But like one of the things we're going to be able to do is at any particular time find out where your message is, where did it come from, how did it get there, why did your transaction abort, why did you get access denied. So we'll have a very rich tracing and infrastructure for figuring out where messages are and how they're flowing through. We'll also have full support for all the performance counters, so you'll be able to figure out all the things in COM+ like transactions per second, the current number of active transactions, and so on.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question on COM+ partitioning and
Okay.
moving forward. We have an early but fairly significant investment in using COM+ partitioning with our classic Microsoft development as well as our new .NET development.
Okay.
Is Indigo going to make that more confusing to move that forward? I mean, I'm just getting my hands around how to deal with the COM+ partitioning in the .NET world and
All right.
try to get a sense of where we're going with that and with Indigo.
So I'd love to talk to you about how you're using partitions, by the way. So what partitions, for those of you who don't know, the core root of the idea behind partitions is that an activation request comes in. And what we do is instead of keying off of the class ID, we key off of the class ID and the caller, the identity of the caller, and then we'll pick a new class for you to activate based on the identity of the caller. So for example, you could have an application that's configured for tellers and for managers, and the client stays exactly the same. When you log on as a manager, you get manager functionality. And the way you would do that inside of Indigo is you build routing, use the routing infrastructure. And so inside of routing, you could just say, you could look at who the identity of the sender is, and based upon that, route to a different service. And so you'll get all of that functionality in actually a much more integrated, seamless way with Indigo than you have today. One of the things that we should talk about is how your app works to see how we can migrate that to Indigo the easiest way. You might be a real great candidate for the early adopter program for Indigo, so that you can look at that and see and let us know how it's working for you.
Great, thanks.
The person to talk to you for that is Angela, right here on the second row.
Go ahead.
Okay, actually my question is your first question in your first slide, if I remember. Basically is how to transfer large binary data in Indigo.
Okay, so that's not exactly what I was getting at. I was talking about taking existing binaries and moving them. But the answer to how you transfer large binary data is that there'll be a binary streaming API that you'll be able to use streaming style interfaces to move large binary data so that you can chunk it up and we can receive it and then reassemble it in a way.
Do you have any samples?
I don't think there's any samples in the existing bits. There'll be samples when we ship beta 1.
Okay, thank you.
This is a follow-up on his question, which comes down to what's the runtime host in Indigo? What's the XE, or does it exist?
So Indigo actually doesn't care what it's hosted in, and we can be hosted in service host, we can be hosted in DLL host, we can be hosted in W3 WP, which is the IIS hosting model. We've actually done a lot of integration with IIS, and so what happens is when you send a message to a machine that has nothing running, let's say you'll go over HTTP, what will happen is HTTP.sys will pick up that message, send it off to the web host service, which will then look on configuration and find out what process you need to run in, launch the process, and then dispatch into the service inside of that process.
From a prescriptive standpoint, the implication was that IIS really is maybe the preferred host. Is that the app server now? Is that really where we should be deploying our applications?
Like app server is an interesting word.
Yeah, I didn't want to use the word. But
I think that's fine. There's going to be features that you're going to want inside of COM+ process model, like the gentleman who was using partitions that you need to have there. But especially with IIS-6, where HTTP.sys is running inside the kernel, unless you need some specific security features, the way I would build my application is I would make my COM+ applications library applications, and then I'd load those library applications into the IIS process model and let IIS control recycling and so on.
Okay, thanks.
If I will write an Indigo application, it will run only on Longhorn or in other legacy Windows platform like Windows 2000 or Windows 2003?
So the question is, what platforms will Indigo run on? Indigo will run on Windows XP, Windows 2003, and Longhorn.
A question about remoting support.
Okay.
Remoting has some features which are not typically available in service model. In a service model, like for example, client-activated objects, in which you have stateful remote objects, and the client controls the lifetime of the object,
right,
or the possibility to pass references to objects.
Right.
Will this still be supported through Indigo?
Yeah, Indigo will fully support the transparent.
Sorry?
Indigo will fully support the transparent remoting model, including stateful objects. You just have to mark your class as being a remote object and activate it with create proxy. Other than that, all reference passing will be supported, stateful objects will be supported, client controlled lifetime will be supported, and so on. That's fully supported.
Okay.
I've got classes that are written in .NET C#, they're derived from enterprise services, but I've turned on the queuing front end. What happens with this?
Okay, so when you turn on queuing, so you're using QC?
Yeah.
Right, so what will happen there is that there'll be a new attribute inside of Indigo whose name we're kind of working out that you just say, I want to be queued. And what it does there, instead of going through all of the MSMQ infrastructure, it'll go through the queuing infrastructure inside of Indigo.
Will I still get the drop-down kind of retry stuff that I get with MSMQ?
The semantics around the dead letter queue and how all that stuff works will be slightly different, but you'll get similar functionality.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, when you say it was going to be more difficult to migrate from WSE style coding to Indigo style coding, is that just because of the way you glue in the various additional services, the security and so on, or can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, I think the way you characterize it is right. I think that another way to think about it is that the purpose of WSE is to get features and functionality out to our customers as soon as possible, and that when we're doing that, we're going to make some tactical decisions about how we expose things. We're going to make some tactical decisions about what infrastructure that we're using to provide that functionality to you. And that when we're coming out with Indigo, we're building a platform for the next 10, 20 years. We want to make sure all that is factored seamlessly together. And so we can't really make any guarantees about what's going to happen inside of WSE and what's going to happen inside of Indigo and have them be convergent. I don't know if that answers your question.
Will it have much actual impact on the inside the function code or the style of the application itself?
I would expect the code inside the function in the very worst case is you rewrite your class, your object model, and you take the code inside the function and paste it in. All that logic, all the business logics remain exactly the same.
Is there going to be an update to WSE?
Yes.
When will that be?
I don't know. Omri Gazette in our booth should know exactly what the story is to that. We're working on a beta right now, so soon, I think is the answer. Where's Yasser, is that you? Do you know the answer?
The answer is come to the Indigo panel tomorrow and ask Omri that question.
Oh, perfect.
Does Indigo provide any extension points so that an Indigo client can talk to a Corva server via IIOP?
Indigo will provide all kinds of extensibility points where you can build arbitrary channels, arbitrary formatters, and you can go through and build that code yourself. We are not building that in the product team.
All right, thanks.
Complus CLB, would it still work on top of Indigo?
Well, Complex CLB will still work. It won't work on top of Indigo. So let me think about this one. There's a couple of ways. First of all, Indigo will provide a way of doing all the CLB style routing based upon workload or round robin using the routing infrastructure. If you expose a let me think about this for a bit and what happens when you expose a complex service of web services that is also configured to use CLB. I would actually expect it, if you're using the existing protocols, to work, because all the CLB is implemented as part of the activation infrastructure and is very closely tied to the way activations work, which when we move to a different protocol, we'll be going through a different code path. And so I expect that what will happen is that you'll have to decide to expose your complex application as a web service, and if you're using web service protocols, use a different style of load balancing, like the Indigo style load balancing instead of the component load balancing. Does that make sense? I can explain more afterwards. But actually, I have now in real time thought about how it works. Any other questions? One over here.
I had two questions.
Okay.
First one is, what's the clustering model with Indigo? Will I still be able to do MSCS clustering? If so, how does the whole thing work?
So the question is how we will work with with the Microsoft clustering. For me, that comes down to how you're doing your state management. In Indigo, there are, in particular, two kinds of state that you're going to care a lot about when it comes to clusters. One is where are your durable messages stored, and the second one is how does your transactions work. And the transactions will all fully support the Microsoft clustering stuff, as will the log that we use to do our durable messages. So all of that will fail over automatically. We're not going to provide anything in V1 that provides failover for application state. That's something that you as a developer will write to make sure that your state fails over automatically if you have any kind of state.
But we can still host like an Indigo app on a cluster.
Absolutely, you can host an Indigo app on a
How
cluster.
about complex components? For instance, today I have complex components. I don't really have to host them in the cluster. I just create a cluster and then the RPC decom layer figures out which node to call to. How will that work?
That should work just pretty much exactly the same. Okay. That's all about the virtual IP address, and that should be okay.
Okay. The second question is, with the load balancing style activation that we are doing, we are basically having to, every time we call a method, we create an object, call the method, and then delete the object, right? So will that be the model going forward? Because the load balancing itself is done only at the activation point of view, for instance, with CLPS. If that's my mechanism to load balance complex components, that's what I'm doing today. Or is the model changing towards create an object once and keep calling methods periodically?
Well, so with CLB, what happens is the load balancing happens at activation time.
Right.
And so when you create a reference, you get pinned to that particular server. Sometimes that works depending on what the nature of your load is. With Indigo, it's all messaging infrastructure. And so if you are communicating as you should be across node using service-oriented technology, and that you're using stateless methods there that are marked as service method, then when you send a message, the message payload contains all the parameters you need to do your work, and it's all of the state you need to do the work is inside of that one message. And so you didn't do content, you didn't do load balancing at the time of sending the message. And so you actually never have a reference in the client. What you have on the client is a proxy that is really just causing you to, is a program model construct that allows you to construct your message and send your message.
So the load balancing really is at the point of method call.
It can be at a point of method call. And the other thing you do is Indigo has a very rich infrastructure for supporting intermediaries. And so what you can do is you can actually send the message to a router, which then does any kind of arbitrary XPath filtering on the message headers and then sends it out to whatever server you want to send it out to.
Okay.
So you can build up actually much richer load balancing than we have today in COM+.
What will be inbuilt as far as load balancing goes? Well, all of the richness that you just talked about.
I didn't hear the first part.
So you just told me that I could have an intermediary and I can build an XPath query. What would come shipped with Indigo by default? Will that be a simple router?
Indigo by default will build the routing class, but we won't build the server. What you'll have to do is you'll have to write, I think it's going to be about 10 lines of code to build the server, and then you'll be responsible for deploying that and managing that particular server. Okay. In subsequent versions of Indigo, we'll heavily invest in building servers to do all that stuff for you automatically.
Okay. How about the shared property manager?
Spam. Something near and dear to my heart. I actually was responsible for spam in COM+ 1.0. No, we're not bringing spam forward. We'll have a much better way of doing all of that, that stuff. I'm not a big spam fan. I can explain to you why afterwards, Eli.
So any code that we write today in COM+ that uses...
Well, spam will still be there, right? The classes will still be there. You still be able to create and call and stick things in spam and pull things out of spam. And we're doing lots of work now to integrate the system.transactions together with the COM+ context-based transactions. But what happens with spam is that when the context transaction commits, it goes to spam and release the log. The problem is when you're running inside of Indigo, you won't have a COM+ context. So there won't be anything to release the log. And so you'll probably have to go through and build a resource manager using the system.transactions. And I don't know if you saw Jim Johnson's talk last night. You implement 3 methods.
Right.
Prepare, commit, abort. And what you would do on the commit side or the abort side is you would call back into spam and tell it to release the log.
So in the Indigo world, what would be the way to do something like what we can do today?
Well, that's one of the bullets in my slides talking about state services. We're not providing a lot of user-level state services inside of Indigo. That's something that we'll invest in subsequent versions.
Okay.
Great questions. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm basically following up on the previous 2 questioners who asked a lot of the specific questions I had about clustering and load balancing, but I'm still kind of left a little confused as to what is the overall vision for using Indigo for high availability services.
Okay. So you want the overall vision. That's actually probably a longer talk. Maybe we should do that one offline. Is that okay?
Okay.
I'm not going to answer your question unless you stand up to the mic.
Since I was going to ask my second question, I wanted to ask you if it was all right with you to do that. My question is, would you be able to extend the attribute-based model and insert your own services? Today, the
Yes.
object context is blocked.
Yes. Everything in Indigo will be fully... as a matter of fact, the way Indigo is organized is there's two teams in Indigo. There's my team and there's Eric Zinda's team. And largely what happens is Eric Zinda's team builds this core infrastructure like the core messaging, and then they expose extensibility points. And then what my team does is we build all of our infrastructure to those extensibility points. So when we built the transaction attributes, it's using exactly the same extensibility points that you as a customer would use to build your own extensibility inside there. There's no private APIs between the teams. Right? So you could do, if you think about the transaction and security attributes, you'll have access to exactly the same extensibility points to build any custom attributes that you want. You can even build your own security attributes, your own transaction attributes, if for some reason you don't like mine.
Looks like from your description that you're taking away the component-oriented model and sort of forcing the service model. And a lot of these services, like this lady talked about, shared property manager, component load balancing, you're expecting folks to build it themselves and sort of...
So the way to think about this is in the short term, right, in V1 of Indigo, we're building a platform and we want to ship this platform. And that as we go through and make decisions about what we can have in an all-encompassing release in the first version, and that I strongly believe the most important thing for us to get is get the platform exactly right, get the infrastructure exactly right, and get the API exactly right so that you can start taking that, start building applications with it, start experimenting applications with it, and that it's a decision that we have to make about what our feature set is in V1 versus V2, and that we will continue. We'll build all of those things in the fullness of time.